I remember the exact sound my body made when it finally gave up on me. A dull, wet thud against the polished concrete floor of the distribution warehouse, loud enough that the conveyor belt seemed to hesitate, as if even the machines were startled by how suddenly I disappeared from my own life. And the last thing I saw before everything went dark was my phone lighting up in my pocket with a notification I didn't have the strength to check, which felt cruel in hindsight because it was probably the last moment I could have stopped what happened next, the moment that would prove, once and for all, where I truly stood in my family. I woke up to the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, my mouth dry, my arms heavy, my chest aching like someone had tied a rope around my ribs and kept pulling. And when I tried to move, a nurse immediately noticed and pressed a hand gently against my shoulder, telling me to stay still, telling me I was lucky, telling me I'd collapsed at work and been unconscious for almost 4 minutes, long enough for my supervisor to panic and call emergency services, long enough for the doctors to classify it as a serious medical event, long enough that hospital protocol kicked in and they reached out to my listed emergency contacts, which, without thinking, were still my parents. I asked before anything else if they were on their way, because even after years of quiet neglect and subtle cruelty, a part of me still believed that when it really mattered, when the words "your son collapsed" were spoken out loud, something primal would override everything else and they would come. But the nurse didn't answer right away, and that pause told me more than words ever could. She glanced at the chart, softened her voice, and said they'd been contacted, that messages were left, that the hospital had followed up twice, and then she added carefully that there had been no response yet. At first, I made excuses for them in my own head, told myself maybe they were busy, maybe they were driving, maybe they hadn't seen the call, because denial is easier than accepting the truth when the truth has teeth. But time stretched, minutes folded into hours, and the daylight shifted through the narrow window while my parents never appeared, not even for a moment, not even to stand awkwardly at the foot of the bed and pretend to care. Instead, when I finally had the strength to reach for my phone, my hands still shaking from dehydration and fear, I saw what that notification had been earlier, the one that lit up just before I collapsed, and my stomach twisted so violently I thought I might pass out all over again, because it was a tag from my sister, Emily, posted publicly for everyone to see, a glossy, smiling photo of her standing in front of a luxury rooftop restaurant, champagne glass raised, city lights glowing behind her like a crown, captioned with a laughing emoji and the words, "Some people fake emergencies to get attention. Could never be me," face with tears of joy, #DramaKing. And the timestamp showed it was posted less than 20 minutes after the hospital first tried to call my parents. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, my heart pounding harder than it had before I collapsed, because that wasn't just cruelty, that was coordination, that was a message, and suddenly everything from my childhood clicked into place like a sick puzzle finally solved. Emily had always been the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, the one whose mistakes were reframed as learning experiences, while my smallest failures were treated like moral flaws. And growing up, I learned quickly that love in our family wasn't unconditional, it was transactional, measured by usefulness, by image, by how well you fit the story my parents wanted to tell other people. Emily fit that story perfectly: beautiful, ambitious, loud, always performing, success even when it was built on credit cards and our parents' money. While I was the quiet son, the one who worked 2 jobs, who paid his own way, who didn't ask for help because every request came with invisible strings and unspoken resentment. When I moved out, I thought distance would heal things, that adulthood would level the playing field, but what actually happened was worse. My absence made it easier for them to forget me entirely, except when they needed someone to blame or compare Emily against to make her shine brighter. Lying there in the hospital bed, monitors beeping softly beside me, I realized this wasn't neglect born of thoughtlessness. This was a choice, reinforced by years of patterns I'd ignored because acknowledging them meant accepting that my parents had picked a side long ago. The doctor eventually came in and explained that severe exhaustion, stress, and untreated symptoms had combined into a perfect storm, that my body had been sending warning signals for months, signals I'd ignored because I couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford to be weak, especially not in a family where weakness was punished with ridicule. He asked if I had anyone who could stay with me overnight after discharge, and I almost laughed at how absurd the question felt, because the people who were supposed to show up for me had already answered that question without saying a word. When visiting hours ended and the hallway grew quiet, I scrolled through Emily's post again, then through the comments, dozens of them, friends and extended relatives laughing along, reinforcing the narrative that I was dramatic, unreliable, a problem, and that's when something inside me hardened, not into anger at first but into clarity. This wasn't just about a missed hospital visit or a cruel social media post. This was about a lifetime of being erased, minimized, and publicly humiliated to preserve someone else's image. And as I lay there alone, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything, a decision my parents and sister would eventually regret more than they could possibly imagine, because if they were so comfortable pretending I didn't exist when I nearly died, then I would stop existing in the only way that ever mattered to them, quietly, completely, and with consequences they never saw coming. The morning after they discharged me, I walked out of the hospital alone with a plastic bag holding my clothes, a folded stack of discharge papers warning me about rest and follow-up appointments I wasn't sure how I'd manage, and a strange hollow calm settling into my chest where fear used to live. Because once you accept that no one is coming for you, the world becomes brutally simple. I took a rideshare back to my apartment because my parents' house, technically still listed as my permanent address, on more paperwork than I like to admit, no longer felt like a place I could even drive past without feeling sick. And the driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like he wanted to ask if I was okay, probably because I looked like someone who had been wrung out and put back together wrong. When I got inside my apartment, the silence hit harder than anything at the hospital, because there was no nurse checking vitals, no machines humming, just the reality that if I had died on that warehouse floor, this space would have stayed exactly the same, untouched, unnoticed, unpaid for until someone eventually evicted a ghost. I lay down on my couch and slept for nearly 12 hours straight, and when I woke up my phone was full. Not of missed calls from my parents or frantic messages asking if I was alive, but of notifications reacting to Emily's post, more likes, more comments, more people reinforcing the idea that my pain was entertainment. What hurt almost as much as the post itself was seeing familiar names in that comment section. An aunt who used to pinch my cheek and say I was her favorite, a cousin who borrowed money from me last year and still hadn't paid it back, even one of my parents' friends chiming in with a laughing emoji, because in my family, public perception mattered more than private truth, and Emily had always been the one trusted to control the narrative. I finally got a text from my mother that afternoon, a single sentence that felt more like a formality than concern, saying she heard I'd had a little episode at work, and hoped I was being less dramatic now, followed by a reminder that Emily was hosting a small celebration dinner that weekend and it would be best if I didn't come and make things awkward, which was when the calm inside me finally cracked into something colder and more focused. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on none at all, because I realized that engaging only fed the story they'd already written about me, and for the first time in my life I didn't want to defend myself, I wanted to observe. Over the next few days as I rested like the doctor ordered, I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before, details that only became obvious once I stopped chasing approval like it was oxygen. My parents' calls always came after Emily complained about something, never before. Family group chats lit up with praise when Emily posted another staged success, but went dead whenever I shared anything real, even the financial help my parents occasionally offered me came with lectures and strings that Emily never seemed to have attached to her endless bailouts. It dawned on me that my role in the family ecosystem wasn't to be loved, it was to be used as contrast, the struggling son who made the daughter look brighter by comparison. That realization sent me digging, not out of revenge at first, but out of a need to understand how deep this rot went, and that's when I started reviewing old emails, bank statements, and documents I'd saved without much thought over the years, things related to a small trust my grandparents had set up before they died. Something my parents always insisted was mostly for Emily because she needs more support, while I was told I'd get whatever was left. I'd accepted that explanation for years because questioning it meant questioning my parents' integrity, and that felt like a line I wasn't allowed to cross, but now that line didn't exist anymore. As I cross-referenced dates and amounts, a disturbing picture began to form, one that suggested money had been moving in ways that didn't add up, withdrawals timed perfectly around Emily's failed ventures and sudden lifestyle upgrades, while my portion of the trust remained conveniently inaccessible due to administrative delays that somehow never resolved. The more I looked, the more my collapse at work started to feel less like an isolated health scare and more like the inevitable result of being financially and emotionally bled dry, while someone else lived loudly off the same family resources. And I wondered, not for the first time, how different my life might have been if even a fraction of the support given to Emily had ever flowed in my direction. The anger finally came then, slow and heavy, Not explosive but grounding, because it wasn't just about being abandoned in a hospital bed. It was about realizing that my parents' absence wasn't passive. It was strategic. They couldn't show up for me without acknowledging that I was human, vulnerable, deserving, and that acknowledgement threatened a carefully maintained illusion where Emily was the only child worth investing in. By the end of the week, I had a growing folder on my laptop labeled simply Proof, and every file inside it felt like a brick being stacked quietly behind the scenes, because while my family was busy laughing at a meme version of my suffering, they had no idea I was finally seeing them clearly, and once you see the truth, you can never unsee it, and you can never go back to playing the role they wrote for you. By the time my follow-up appointment rolled around, I had stopped expecting kindness from anyone whose last name matched mine, and that shift in expectation changed the way I listened to people, especially professionals who had no reason to lie to me. The cardiologist was blunt in a way that felt almost refreshing, explaining that what happened to me wasn't random bad luck. It was cumulative damage, months of overwork layered on top of stress my body never had a chance to process, and when he asked about my support system, I surprised myself by telling the truth instead of performing resilience the way I always had, admitting that I didn't really have one, that my parents were busy people, and my sister and I weren't close, which earned me a long searching look before he said something that stuck with me long after I left his office. Your body collapsed because it learned no one else was going to carry the weight. That sentence echoed in my head as I walked back to my car, because it reframed my entire life not as a series of personal failures, but as survival under conditions that were never meant to be sustainable, and once I saw it that way, the shame I'd been carrying for years finally began to loosen its grip. I took a few more days off work, something I'd never allowed myself before, and used that time to keep digging not obsessively but methodically the way someone does when they're done being gaslit and just want facts. I called the financial institution that managed my grandparents' trust and, for the first time, didn't accept vague answers, didn't let myself be redirected to my parents because they handle family matters. And after being transferred twice, I reached a woman who spoke carefully but clearly, explaining that according to their records, my portion of the trust had technically matured years ago, but disbursements were delayed due to instructions placed by the trustees, my parents, citing concerns about my financial stability. I almost laughed at the irony because the instability they were so concerned about was largely the result of them blocking access to resources that were legally mine. But what stopped me cold was when she added, almost as an afterthought, that multiple early withdrawals had been approved for Emily under a hardship exception, something I'd never been informed about and had never consented to. When I asked for documentation, she hesitated, then said she could email me a summary, and when it arrived, my hands actually shook as I scrolled through pages of transactions that painted a story so clear it felt scripted. Money flowing out whenever Emily's life hit turbulence. Money flowing out to cover luxury rent increases labeled as business expenses. Money flowing out for education that never resulted in a degree, while my name appeared mostly in notes about risk and delay. It wasn't just favoritism, it was extraction, a slow siphoning justified by a narrative my parents had clearly fed to anyone who questioned it, and seeing it in black and white did something to me that years of emotional neglect never quite managed. It erased my last instinct to protect them. That night, as if summoned by the universe's twisted sense of timing, Emily went live on social media from the same rooftop restaurant she seemed to treat like a second home, her face glowing, her laugh loud, and at one point she casually joked about how some people in her family were always having crises and expecting to be rescued, while she believed in earning your way, and the comments flooded in with praise for her independence, her hustle, her strength, and I felt a strange detachment. Watching it like I was finally seeing a play I'd been forced to participate in from the audience instead of the stage. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd started forwarding copies of those trust documents to a private email address, that I'd scheduled a consultation with an attorney recommended by a coworker who'd once gone through a nasty inheritance dispute, and that I was beginning to understand something far more dangerous than anger: leverage. The attorney didn't dramatize things, didn't promise revenge or instant justice, but she did confirm that if the documents were accurate, my parents' actions lived in a gray area that could quickly turn black under scrutiny, especially if funds meant for one beneficiary were misused to prop up another. And when she asked me what outcome I wanted, I told her I didn't want to punish anyone, I just wanted the truth acknowledged. A statement that earned me a sympathetic smile and a gentle warning that families rarely take accountability without being forced. Driving home afterward, I realized that my parents' refusal to come to the hospital wasn't just emotional abandonment, it was strategic distance, because showing up would have meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had a way of unraveling secrets, and they couldn't risk that. Not when so much of their carefully curated image depended on the illusion that Emily's success was self-made and my struggles were self-inflicted. That night I added one more document to my proof folder, a written timeline of everything I could remember, every time I'd been told now isn't a good time, when asking about the trust, every comment about my supposed irresponsibility, every comparison that framed Emily as worthy and me as defective, and as I typed, I felt something settle into place, a resolve that didn't need their approval or their apology, because I was no longer trying to be seen by them, I was preparing to be undeniable. The invitation arrived 2 days later in the form of a group text that pretended to be casual but felt carefully engineered. My mother announcing a small family dinner at their house to celebrate Emily's latest milestone. Some vague professional win that sounded impressive without ever being specific, followed by a line that said she hoped everyone could be supportive and drama-free, which might as well have been addressed directly to me even though my name wasn't mentioned. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling my pulse pick up in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the warehouse floor. And for a moment I considered ignoring it the way I'd ignored so many subtle slights before. But something inside me knew that this dinner wasn't optional. Not anymore, because avoidance had only ever protected them, never me. I replied simply that I would be there. And the typing bubbles that appeared and disappeared in the group chat told me everything about how unexpected that answer was. The day of the dinner, I took my time getting ready, choosing clothes that made me feel steady rather than impressive, because I wasn't going to perform strength for anyone. And as I drove to my parents' house, a place that still smelled like my childhood in ways I couldn't quite articulate, I rehearsed nothing, trusting that the truth had a way of surfacing on its own when the conditions were right. From the moment I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with forced cheer, Emily already holding court in the living room, her laughter ringing out a little too loudly, her eyes flicking toward me just long enough to register surprise before sliding back into indifference, and my parents greeted me with polite hugs that felt more like obligations than affection, my mother whispering that she was glad I was feeling better, in a tone that suggested the entire episode was an inconvenience she was relieved had passed. Dinner unfolded like a performance, my father praising Emily's ambition, my mother recounting stories of her resilience, and every compliment landed like a reminder of how carefully curated this narrative was, how much energy they'd invested in making sure only one version of the truth existed at this table. I listened more than I spoke, noting how often my name came up only as a comparison or a joke, my recent collapse reframed as a stress-induced overreaction, something to be lightly teased rather than taken seriously. And when Emily finally turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked if I was done with the drama now, something in the room shifted. I didn't raise my voice or accuse anyone outright. Instead, I asked a simple question, one that had been burning in my chest for days, about the trust my grandparents had left us, about how long my portion had been held back and why, and the silence that followed was so sudden it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My parents exchanged a look I'd seen countless times before. A silent negotiation about what story to tell, and my mother finally answered with the same rehearsed explanation I'd heard for years, that they were just being careful, that they wanted to make sure I was ready, that Emily had needed support at critical moments, and that everything they'd done was out of love, but this time, I didn't let the words wash over me. I asked if support included approving early withdrawals without my knowledge, if carefulness meant labeling me financially unstable while funding luxury expenses for my sister. And as I spoke, Emily's smile faltered, her posture stiffening as if she suddenly realized this wasn't a conversation she could laugh her way through. My father tried to redirect, suggesting we talk about this privately later, but I shook my head, pointing out that my financial future had been managed publicly enough to be joked about online, and if it was appropriate for social media, it was appropriate for the dinner table. That was when Emily snapped, accusing me of being jealous, of trying to sabotage her moment, of always needing to make things about me. And my mother rushed to her defense, insisting I was misinterpreting everything because of stress, because of my condition, a word she used with just enough emphasis to make it sound like an inherent flaw rather than a temporary state. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, but instead I did something that surprised even me. I told them about the hospital, not the sanitized version they preferred, but the reality that the doctors had called them, that they hadn't come, that I'd lain there alone while Emily posted jokes about my supposed attention-seeking, and the way my mother's face drained of color in that moment told me she hadn't realized how exposed they were. Emily scoffed, claiming she'd been misquoted, that people were too sensitive, but when I pulled out my phone and read her caption word for word, the room fractured, my father staring at the table, my mother's hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass, and for the first time in my life I saw fear in Emily's eyes, not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control of the story. I didn't demand an apology or a confession. I simply said I was done being treated like a liability, done being used as a foil, and that from now on any decisions involving my life or my inheritance would involve me directly. And as I stood up to leave, the silence followed me to the door, heavy and unresolved, because they all knew what I hadn't said yet was far more dangerous than what I had. The real turning point came not with a courtroom filing or a dramatic public exposure, but with a single envelope that arrived at my apartment one quiet afternoon, thicker than any mail I'd received in years and addressed in my grandmother's careful handwriting, forwarded from a storage company my parents had quietly stopped paying once they assumed no one else cared what was inside. Holding it felt unreal, like touching a voice I hadn't heard since childhood, and when I opened it, I found more than the letter I already knew about. There were copies of handwritten notes, dated entries, and even a recorded message transcribed by a family attorney decades earlier, all outlining my grandparents' growing concern over how my parents treated their grandchildren differently, particularly how Emily was indulged while I was expected to become small so others could grow large. Reading those words broke something open in me that I'd kept sealed for survival, because for the first time, someone had seen what was happening while it was happening and had cared enough to document it. The documents made it painfully clear that the trust was never meant to be a reward system for the loudest child or the most socially impressive one. It was designed as a safeguard against exactly the kind of imbalance that had defined my life, and my grandparents had even included a clause recommending trustee removal if favoritism became evident, a clause my parents had conveniently never mentioned. When my attorney reviewed the new material, she didn't smile, didn't celebrate, but she did lean back in her chair and say, "This changes everything." And in that moment I felt the weight shift decisively, because the story was no longer my word against theirs, it was documented intent against manipulation. The legal response that followed was swift and unmistakable, my parents' lawyer suddenly far less confident, their tone shifting from defensive to conciliatory, and when the proposal came through suggesting restructuring the trust under an independent administrator with immediate disbursement of my withheld portion, I knew they were no longer trying to win, they were trying to contain the damage. Emily reacted exactly the way someone does when a mirror is finally placed in front of them after years of controlled lighting, posting cryptic messages about betrayal and abandonment, then deleting them when engagement dipped, her public confidence cracking just enough for people to notice, and for the first time, comments appeared asking uncomfortable questions she couldn't easily deflect. My parents, meanwhile, tried to frame the restructuring as a mutual decision, reaching out with rehearsed warmth and carefully worded apologies that never quite took responsibility, and I accepted the outcome without accepting the narrative, because I'd learned the difference between resolution and reconciliation. When the first transfer hit my account, the number staring back at me felt less like a victory and more like a reckoning, a tangible representation of years I'd spent believing I was less worthy, less capable, less deserving, and instead of splurging or announcing it, I paid off debt, reduced my work hours, scheduled the medical care I'd postponed, and began building a life that didn't revolve around proving anything to anyone. The silence from my family grew heavier after that, not explosive, not dramatic, but saturated with something like shame, because once the illusion cracked, there was no elegant way to rebuild it, and I understood then that the collapse at work hadn't been the end of my strength, it had been the moment the lie became unsustainable. The first real consequence didn't come from the money itself but from the way truth changes how people look at you once it's out in the open, because the moment the trust was officially moved under an independent administrator, something subtle but irreversible shifted in my parents' social world, and cracks began forming in places they'd assumed were solid. Questions started circulating quietly among relatives and family friends, the kind that sound innocent on the surface but carry weight underneath, about why the trust needed restructuring, about why my grandparents' wishes had suddenly become relevant after years of silence, and my parents, who had always thrived on controlling the narrative, found themselves stumbling over explanations that no longer landed cleanly. Emily felt it first because her life had always depended on the illusion of effortless success, And when whispers began suggesting that her lifestyle had been subsidized in ways she'd never acknowledged, invitations slowed, brand collaborations she'd hinted at online quietly evaporated, and the comment sections that once fed her ego started asking uncomfortable questions she couldn't delete fast enough. She tried to pivot, posting about independence and reinvention, but reinvention doesn't work when people are still piecing together what you were reinventing yourself from, and for the first time she wasn't ahead of the story, she was chasing it. My parents, meanwhile, attempted damage control through forced reconciliation, reaching out with messages about healing as a family, and moving forward without lawyers, as if the presence of accountability was the real wound, not the years of manipulation that made it necessary. And when I didn't respond the way they expected, their tone hardened, resentment seeping through the carefully chosen words. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer reacting emotionally to any of it, because the moment the funds were properly released and my life began stabilizing, medical appointments attended without fear of cost, work hours reduced without panic, sleep returning in full, uninterrupted stretches, the chaos they thrived on lost its grip on me. Stability does something dangerous to people who rely on imbalance to maintain power. It makes you harder to control, harder to shame, harder to threaten, and as my health improved, so did my clarity, revealing just how much of my family's authority had been built on keeping me exhausted and uncertain. The attorney warned me that the next phase would likely be psychological rather than legal, attempts to provoke guilt, nostalgia, or obligation, and she was right, because my mother soon began sending long messages reminiscing about my childhood, selectively remembering moments where she'd supported me while conveniently omitting the countless times she'd chosen Emily without hesitation. And reading them felt like watching someone try to rewrite a book I'd finally finished reading cover to cover. Emily's attempt was more desperate. She posted a tearful video about losing family over money, framing herself as the collateral damage of my sudden greed. And while it initially gained sympathy, it also triggered responses from people who knew just enough to question her version, comments asking why transparency was such a problem if nothing improper had happened, and that scrutiny, even mild, rattled her more than outright criticism ever could. The most telling moment came when my father called late one night, his voice stripped of its usual authority, asking me, not demanding, to reconsider how public things had become, and when I reminded him that none of this would have left the family if they hadn't made my suffering public first, there was a long silence on the line that spoke louder than any apology. That was when I understood the true karmic shift at play. They weren't losing money, they were losing control, and control had always been the currency that mattered most to them. As the weeks passed, my life continued to expand in quiet, meaningful ways, new routines, healthier boundaries, a sense of self that wasn't defined by comparison. And while my family grew smaller, it also grew clearer, because every relationship that remained was one that didn't require me to disappear to function. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive watching my parents struggle to maintain their image or seeing Emily grapple with the first real consequences of a curated life. I felt resolved, grounded in the knowledge that my collapse hadn't been a failure but a turning point, the moment my body forced me to stop absorbing damage that was never mine to carry. And as the final phase approached, one truth became undeniable. The reckoning wasn't over yet, but it was no longer something happening to me, it was something unfolding because I had finally stepped out of the role they needed me to play. The final unraveling didn't arrive with shouting or courtrooms or viral exposés, but with a sequence of quiet losses that hit my family harder than any public humiliation ever could, because they were forced to live inside the consequences of their own choices without an audience to blame. The independent administrator completed the trust review and issued a formal summary to all beneficiaries and trustees, a dry, clinical document that laid out years of discretionary decisions in neutral language, but neutrality has a way of making favoritism unmistakable, and once it existed in writing, my parents could no longer pretend their actions were merely misunderstood acts of love. Extended relatives who had once parroted their version of events began distancing themselves, not dramatically, just enough to signal discomfort, and invitations my parents had once taken for granted quietly stopped arriving, replaced by polite excuses and delayed responses, because people are wary of those who appear to manage fairness selectively. Emily felt the consequences most acutely, because without the safety net she'd always assumed would be there, her lifestyle began to contract in visible ways, the luxury apartment replaced by something more modest, the spontaneous trips disappearing from her feed, and while she tried to rebrand this as intentional minimalism, the strain showed in how tightly she clung to validation. She reached out to me once more, not with anger or tears this time, but with exhaustion, admitting she didn't know how to live without being rescued. A confession that might have moved me years earlier, but now only confirmed what I'd already learned, that empathy without accountability only resets the cycle. I told her I hoped she found stability, but that it wouldn't come from me sacrificing my own. And as we hung up, I realized that was the first boundary I'd ever set with her that didn't come with an apology attached. My parents attempted one last maneuver, suggesting a family meeting to put everything behind us. But when I asked what specifically they were taking responsibility for, the conversation stalled, because reconciliation requires truth, and truth was the one thing they still refused to offer. Life, meanwhile, continued to move forward for me in ways that felt almost anticlimactic: steady health reports, manageable work, mornings that didn't begin with dread. And it struck me that the most radical outcome of everything I'd been through wasn't revenge or justice, but peace. The absence of constant tension revealed just how much of my identity had been shaped by opposition, by trying to prove I was worthy of care. And once that need dissolved, so did the power my family held over me. The final karmic twist arrived quietly, almost mundanely, when I received notice that the trust's remaining assets had been fully secured according to my grandparents' original framework, including provisions that limited discretionary advances without unanimous oversight, effectively ending the pattern that had defined my upbringing. And reading that confirmation felt like closing a door not out of spite, but out of necessity. I didn't announce it, didn't confront anyone with it, because the people who needed to know already did. And as the distance between me and my family solidified into something stable rather than painful, I understood that their greatest punishment wasn't legal or financial, it was irrelevance. They no longer dictated my worth, my narrative, or my future, and in stepping away without bitterness, I'd removed the last incentive for the system they built to keep running, leaving them to face a truth they could no longer redirect or ignore. The son they'd overlooked had not only survived without them, he had become unreachable to their manipulation, and that realization, unspoken but unmistakable, was the consequence they would carry long after the conflict faded from view. The real ending didn't announce itself as an ending at all, which felt fitting, because my entire life had been shaped by moments that only mattered once you stepped far enough away to see the pattern, and this was no different. Months after the trust was finalized and the noise around my family settled into an uneasy quiet, I found myself standing in a place I never expected to be, not physically but internally, where the absence of chaos felt normal instead of suspicious. My health stabilized in ways the doctor said were remarkable but made perfect sense to me, because when your nervous system stops bracing for impact every day, the body remembers how to heal, and I realized that what nearly killed me at work wasn't weakness, it was the cost of surviving in an environment that demanded constant self-erasure. My parents stopped reaching out altogether, not out of respect, but because there was nothing left to extract, no leverage, no guilt they could successfully trigger, and that silence, once terrifying, became one of the greatest gifts I'd ever received. Emily's life continued, smaller and quieter, and every so often I'd hear updates through distant relatives about career pivots and fresh starts, each one framed optimistically but carrying the unmistakable weight of someone learning consequences for the first time. And while a younger version of me might have felt vindicated, all I felt now was distance, the emotional kind that signals a chapter truly closed. The final karmic twist revealed itself slowly, not through loss on their side, but through gain on mine, because as I rebuilt my life with intention rather than urgency, opportunities emerged that had never been possible when I was exhausted and insecure. Work that respected boundaries, relationships that didn't require performance, friendships built on mutual care instead of competition. And one evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized with a jolt that no one in my family knew the details of my life anymore, not where I worked, not how I spent my time, not who mattered to me, and that anonymity felt like freedom. I wrote a letter to my grandparents that night, knowing they'd never read it, thanking them not just for the trust they left behind, but for the foresight to document the truth when they sensed it would someday be needed. And in doing so, I finally let go of the last fantasy that my parents would one day understand or apologize. The collapse that once felt like humiliation now stood in my memory as a line between two lives, the one where I was expendable, and the one where I chose myself without asking permission. And the irony that still made my chest tighten was this: the moment my parents decided I wasn't worth showing up for was the moment they lost the right to define me forever. I didn't win by taking something from them. I won by stopping them from taking anything else from me. And as I moved forward into a future shaped by stability instead of survival, I understood that some families don't break you loudly, they break you quietly, and healing isn't about fixing that family, it's about building a life so solid that their absence can never collapse you again. Friends, if you liked our story, then be sure to like and comment on the video. And to watch such story videos, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you will receive our new content every day.